The air in the Teton Basin of 1832 did not smell of peace. It smelled of wet earth, beaver musk, and the lingering ozone of a summer storm. For the mountain men, those gritty, iron-willed precursors to civilization, the annual rendezvous was meant to be a sanctuary of commerce. But history, as recorded in the frantic journals of men like Zenas Leonard and Nathaniel Wyeth, tells us that the threshold between a profitable season and a shallow grave was thinner than a weathered buckskin tunic. We find ourselves in Pierre's Hole, a lush valley shadowed by the jagged teeth of the Grand Tetons, where the end of a long, grueling trade season was about to be baptized in black powder and swamp water. To understand the sheer terror of this moment, one must look at the forgotten customs of the mountain men. They lived by a code of hypervigilance, yet even they were unprepared for the visual that met their eyes on that July morning. A brigade of Gros Ventre, fierce allies of the Blackfoot, was moving through the valley. This was not a chance encounter, it was a collision of destinies. The primary historical record indicates that the violence began not with a strategic plan, but with a betrayal. A veteran trapper named Antoine Gaudin, whose own father had been murdered by the Blackfoot years prior, rode out to meet the Gros Ventre chief under a flag of truce. In a cold, calculated act of vengeance that would ignite a firestorm, Gaudin extended his hand in a gesture of peace, only to command his companion to fire. As the chief fell, the peaceful trade evaporated into the humid Idaho air, replaced by the screams of 200 warriors seeking blood for blood. The tactical nightmare was immediate. The Gros Ventre did not flee. They did what the records of the 1830s describe as a masterstroke of indigenous defensive warfare. They retreated into a dense, swampy thicket of willows and cottonwoods, a natural fortress of mud and tangled branches. For the trappers, the crucial threshold was the edge of that swamp. To enter was to forfeit the advantage of the horse and the long-range rifle. The swamp was a labyrinth where visibility was reduced to a few feet, and the ground was a treacherous slurry that swallowed boots and slowed the heartbeat of even the bravest scout. The technical danger faced here cannot be overstated. In the 1830s, a misfire or a damp primer meant death. The percussion cap and flintlock rifles of the era were temperamental instruments of war. In the humidity of a swamp, the black powder became fouled, and the smoke hung heavy and low, creating a fog of war that was literal rather than metaphorical. The trappers were no longer hunters. They were the hunted, trapped in a geographic bowl where the only supply line back to the settlements was now blocked by a wall of entrenched, vengeful warriors. The despair felt by the greenhorns in Wyeth's party was palpable. A cold realization that the romanticized West was, in reality, a brutal meat grinder where a single mistake in etiquette could lead to a catastrophic loss of life. Historical accounts from this era show that the mountain men were forced into a desperate realization. They could not simply wait them out. The Gros Ventre had begun constructing a fort within the willows, using fallen logs and the natural depression of the earth. Every minute the trappers hesitated, the fortification grew stronger. The threshold had been crossed. There was no retreating to the safety of the main camp. To do so would be to invite a midnight massacre. The only way out was through the mud, through the willows, and through the 200 warriors who had sworn that no white man or rival scout would leave Pierre's Hole alive. Before we dive deeper into the archives of the past, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? To understand the men standing on the precipice of death in Pierre's Hole, we must look beyond the gunpowder and the war cries. We must examine the archive of life, the everyday weight carried by a mountain man in 1832. The harsh reality of the 1880s may have seen the closing of the frontier, but in the early 1830s, the frontier was a raw, bleeding wound. These men were not soldiers, they were commercial ghosts, drifting through a landscape that did not want them. As they crouched in the tall grass outside the Gros Ventre's swampy fortress, their minds were a chaotic ledger of survival. Every piece of equipment they possessed was a testament to their isolation. Historical records from this era show that a trapper's possibles bag was his only lifeline. Inside, the items were humble but sacred. A tin of possibles, including flint, steel, a small lead ladle for casting balls, and perhaps a scrap of a letter from a home they would never see again. The physical sensation of the 1832 rendezvous was one of temporary abundance, followed by immediate crushing scarcity. These men had spent weeks trading beaver plews for overpriced tobacco, lead, and alcohol. Now, that same lead was being hammered back into lethal projectiles to be fired into the dark heart of the willow thicket. The contrast was agonizing. The morning had begun with the hope of a peaceful trek toward the Columbia River. By noon, the history of the everyday was reduced to the frantic scraping of a ramrod against a fouled rifle barrel. The tools of the past tell a story of immense physical resilience. The heavy Hawken rifles, weighing nearly 15 pounds, felt like leaden weights in the humid heat of the swamp. To fire one was a ritual of precision under pressure. You had to measure the black powder from a horn, often carved with folk art or maps of the territory, pour it down the long barrel, seat the patched lead ball with a wooden rod, and then carefully place a percussion cap or prime the pan. In the middle of a bloodbath, this process felt like an eternity. The sensory immersion was overwhelming, the bitter, acrid taste of sulfur on the tongue, the ringing in the ears from the concussive blasts of 200 rifles firing in a confined valley, and the feel of greasy buckskin clinging to sweat-soaked skin. This was the archive of life in its most primal form, the knowledge that if your hands shook, if your powder was damp, or if your flint shattered, your personal history ended in the mud of Pierre's hole. Beyond the tools, there was the weight of memory, the human vulnerability that historians often overlook. Men like William Sublette and Robert Campbell, leaders of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, weren't just thinking of strategy. They were thinking of the years spent in the wilderness, the friends lost to grizzly bears and winter starvation, and the terrifying realization that their entire business empire could vanish in this swamp. The Gros Ventre warriors inside the thicket carried their own archives, songs of their ancestors, the sacred geometry of their war paint, and a fierce, burning memory of every encroachment upon their lands. This was a clash of two different ways of living, both defined by an intimate relationship with the earth. The physical exhaustion was the silent enemy. These men had lived on charqui, dried meat, and coffee for months. Their bodies were maps of scars and old fractures. As they began to crawl toward the Willow Fort, they weren't the heroic icons of later dime novels. They were tired, filthy men who understood the wisdom of silence. They knew that a snapped twig or a heavy breath could draw a volley from an unseen enemy. The swamp was not just a geographic feature, it was a psychological weight. It represented the forgotten customs of a time when man was not at the top of the food chain, but merely another creature fighting for a patch of dry ground. The archives of life were being written in the dirt, where the blood of the mountain men mixed with the stagnant water of the valley, creating a legacy that would be talked about around campfires for decades to come, if anyone survived to tell the tale. To truly grasp the horror of the 1832 Battle of Pierre's Hole, one must look beyond the physical skirmish and into the psychological isolation that defined the life of a mountain man. In the 19th century, the Teton Basin was not just a remote location. It was a void on the map. To be wounded here was to be effectively dead. There were no surgeons, no supply lines, and no reinforcements coming from the east. When the mountain men and their Nez Perce and Flathead allies surrounded the Gros Ventre in that swamp, they weren't just fighting an enemy. They were fighting the suffocating realization of their own insignificance against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The impact of this isolation on the pioneer psyche was profound. Historical records from this era show that the mountain man persona, often portrayed as fearless and stoic, was frequently a mask for a deep, gnawing loneliness. In the heat of the standoff, this isolation transformed into a collective paranoia. The Gros Ventre were hidden behind a curtain of green, a dense thicket of willows so thick that the trappers could hear their enemies breathing and the clicking of their gunlocks, yet could see nothing. This sensory deprivation created a psychological pressure cooker. Every rustle of a leaf became a potential death sentence. The history of the everyday in this moment was the history of the heartbeat, loud and erratic, thumping against a chest tight with the fear of a silent arrow or a sudden close-quarter tomahawk strike. The geography of Pierre's hole exacerbated this feeling of being alone against the world. The valley is a high-altitude bowl surrounded by monolithic peaks that seem to watch the violence with cold detachment. To the trapped Gros Ventre, the isolation was even more acute. They were entrenched with their women and children, their backs against a swamp, surrounded by a coalition of white trappers and rival tribes who sought their total annihilation. The harsh reality of the 1830s meant that mercy was a luxury no one could afford. To be isolated was to be vulnerable, and in the theology of the frontier, vulnerability was a sin punished by death. We must also consider the wisdom of silence that permeated this phase of the battle. As the hours dragged on, the initial adrenaline faded, replaced by a grueling psychological war of attrition. The trappers had to crawl on their bellies through the mud, moving inches at a time. This was a documentary fact of frontier warfare. It was slow, agonizing, and intensely personal. You weren't fighting an army, you were fighting a man you could smell, but not see. The isolation was so absolute that even men standing 5 feet apart felt disconnected, lost in their own private struggle for the next breath. The psychological weight of decision-making in such a vacuum is staggering. When Robert Campbell and William Sublette decided to lead a direct assault into the thicket, they weren't just risking their lives. They were gambling with the survival of the entire fur trade in the Rockies. If the leaders fell, the remaining men, already frayed by the isolation and the eerie silence of the swamp, would likely break and flee, leading to a massacre in the open valley. The forgotten customs of the era dictated that leadership was proven through blood. To command, one had to bleed first. The isolation of the leader is the most profound of all, and as Sublette prepared to charge into the willows, he carried the silent weight of hundreds of men who looked to him to bridge the gap between this hellish swamp and the world they once knew. The air in the willow thicket had become a toxic soup of black powder smoke, the iron scent of blood, and the frantic respiration of men pushed past the brink of human endurance. This was the breaking point, the exact moment in 1832 when the peaceful trade was permanently buried under a pile of spent lead and broken bodies. As the sun began to beat down on the Teton basin, William Sublette, a man whose name was synonymous with the iron grit of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, realized that the standoff could only end in one of two ways: a slow, agonizing retreat or a suicidal surge into the dark heart of the Gros Ventre's fort. The assault was not a cinematic charge. It was a desperate horizontal crawl through a labyrinth of thorns and stagnant water. Historical records from this era show that the fort the Gros Ventre had constructed was a marvel of improvised engineering. They had dug shallow pits and reinforced them with a chaotic weave of green willow branches and fallen cottonwood logs. For the trappers, every inch gained was paid for in flesh. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of frontier combat. This was not a battle of ranks and whistles, but a series of isolated, terrifying duels. A trapper would push aside a branch, only to find himself staring into the dark muzzle of a Northwest trade gun, or the cold, focused eyes of a warrior who had already accepted his death. The breaking point arrived when Sublette and Robert Campbell, followed by a handful of the most seasoned Longshanks, breached the outer perimeter of the thicket. The noise was described by survivors as a continuous, ear-shattering roar. The technical reality of the 1830s meant that once a rifle was fired, it became a clumsy club or a short-range spear with a fixed blade. In the mud of the swamp, the combat turned cruel and powerful. Men grappled in the muck, using knives forged in St. Louis, and tomahawks traded months prior. The harsh reality of the scene was a chaotic blur of brown buckskin and red war paint. Sublette himself became a symbol of this breaking point. As he raised his head to scout the inner breastworks, a Gros Ventre bullet tore through his arm and into his side. The impact was more than physical. It was a shockwave through the ranks of the trappers. Their leader was down, bleeding into the very mud he had sought to conquer. Yet, in the soul of the documentarian, we see that this did not cause a rout. Instead, it ignited a cold, lethal fury. The trappers and their Nez Perce allies began to fire blindly into the center of the fort, where the Gros Ventre had gathered their women and children for protection. Then came the false message, a moment of psychological warfare that defines the gravity of this era. From within the smoke-filled fort, a Gros Ventre warrior shouted out in a language understood by the interpreters. He claimed that a massive force of 800 Blackfoot warriors was at that very moment descending upon the main rendezvous camp, slaughtering the women and plundering the supplies. It was a brilliant, desperate lie designed to break the siege. The effect was instantaneous. Panic, like a wildfire, rippled through the trappers. The fear of losing everything, their horses, their furs, and the lives of those back at camp, forced a chaotic redistribution of forces. The breaking point was reached not through a total military defeat, but through the sheer, overwhelming pressure of the unknown. As the trappers began to peel away from the swamp to defend a camp that wasn't actually under attack, the Gros Ventre saw their opening. Under the cover of the gathering dusk and the thick sulphurous haze, they prepared for a final, silent exodus through the rear of the swamp, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would forever stain the legacy of the 1832 rendezvous. This was the raw, unvarnished climax of Pierre's hole, a victory of survival for some, and a shallow, muddy grave for others, all dictated by a single shouted lie in the heat of a bloodbath. As the first light of the following morning crept over the jagged peaks of the Tetons, the trappers returned to the swamp, expecting a renewed siege. Instead, they found a tomb of silence. The Gros Ventre had vanished under the cover of a moonless night, slipping through the rear of the willow thicket like ghosts. What they left behind was a documentary record of desperation, dead horses, discarded robes, and the shallowly buried remains of their fallen kin. For the mountain men, the historical aftermath was not a victory parade. It was a grueling sensory confrontation with the cost of their trade. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of frontier burial. There were no coffins in Pierre's hole. The fallen trappers, including the brave and the reckless, were wrapped in their own blankets or buffalo robes and lowered into the rocky earth of the valley. Historical records from 1832, specifically the journals of Washington Irving and Nathaniel Wyeth, describe the atmosphere as one of deep and sullen gloom. The harsh reality of the 1830s meant that there was no time for prolonged mourning. The beaver didn't stop breeding, and the winter didn't stop coming. The survivors had to immediately turn their attention to the wounded. William Sublette, his body pierced by lead, had to be carried on a travois, a primitive litter made of poles and hides, across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain. The technical reality of frontier medicine in the aftermath of a bloodbath was horrific. Without antiseptics or anesthesia, the treatment for a gunshot wound was often as life-threatening as the wound itself. We see the human vulnerability in the way these hardened men looked at their shattered limbs. knowing that infection was a more certain killer than a Blackfoot warrior. The history of the everyday in the days following the battle was a ledger of pain. The sound of a bone saw, the smell of searing flesh used to cauterize wounds, and the low moans of men who had once thought themselves invincible. Geographically, the battle changed the map of the fur trade. Pierre's hole was no longer just a beautiful valley. It was a site of trauma. The Gros Ventre, though they had escaped the immediate siege, had suffered a devastating blow to their numbers and their prestige. They retreated toward the Missouri River, their path marked by the graves of those who succumbed to their wounds during the flight. This event solidified the psychological isolation of the region. Every rustle in the grass for the next decade would be viewed through the lens of the 1832 massacre. The historical aftermath also forced a shift in the corporate strategy of the American fur companies. They realized that the era of the peaceful trade was an illusion. To trap in the Rockies was to engage in a low-intensity war. The cost of doing business now included the price of blood. As the trappers finally broke camp and headed toward their respective territories, they left behind a valley that would never again feel like a sanctuary. They carried with them the weight of decisions made in the mud, the memory of the lies told, the friends buried, and the sheer, terrifying randomness of who lived and who died. This was the acceptance of a brutal destiny. In the great tapestry of history, they were the threads being pulled taut, and many were destined to snap. To look upon the tranquil meadows of Pierre's hole today is to witness a profound historical silence. The swamp that once swallowed the cries of the dying and the thunder of black powder is now a place of serene, natural beauty. Yet, for the historian and the storyteller, the legacy of the 1832 battle is a loud, persistent reminder of the cost of human ambition. This was not merely a skirmish. It was a defining moment in the great tapestry of history, where the economic hunger of a young nation met the unyielding sovereignty of its original inhabitants. The tribute to resilience we find here is twofold. We must acknowledge the mountain men like Sublette, Campbell, and Wyeth, who represented a breed of humanity that no longer exists. They possessed a physical and mental fortitude that allowed them to survive infected wounds, sub-zero winters, and the crushing weight of psychological isolation. But we must also honor the resilience of the Gros Ventre and their Blackfoot kin. They fought with a tactical brilliance and a desperate bravery, defending a way of life that was being systematically dismantled by the relentless march of the fur trade. The historical records show us that this battle didn't end the conflict. It merely accelerated it, turning the Rocky Mountains into a theater of war for the next half-century. In the soul of the documentarian, we see that the 1832 rendezvous was the high-water mark of the trapper era. After this bloodbath, the romanticism of the free trapper began to fade, replaced by the cold, calculated efficiency of large-scale corporate interests, and eventually the arrival of the wagon trains. The forgotten customs of the 1830s, the hand-forged knives, the silent communication of the trail, and the blood brotherhoods formed in the mud became the foundation of the American frontier myth. Yet the truth of the facts remains. It was a time of immense human vulnerability, where life was traded for beaver pelts and honor was often sacrificed for survival. As we connect the past to the present, we realize that the story of Pierre's hole is a story of resilience against the elements. It is a philosophical reminder that history is not made of dry dates on a page, but of the sweat, blood, and decisions of individuals caught in the gears of change. The untamed past is not behind us. It is beneath us, providing the roots for the world we inhabit today. We study these moments of honor and sacrifice, not to glorify the violence, but to preserve the memory of the sheer, raw effort it took to survive in a world without safety nets. The swamp in the Teton Basin has long since reclaimed the lead bullets and the wooden shields, but it can never reclaim the stories. These narratives are the archive of the human spirit, proving that even in the darkest, muddiest corners of the wilderness, the light of human courage, however flawed, continues to burn. We remember Pierre's hole, so that the names of the fallen are not lost to the mountain winds, and so that the truth of the frontier remains a living, breathing testament to our collective history. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us at Wildbound History. If you believe these stories of resilience must never be forgotten, hit the like button and subscribe for our next historical journey. Until next time, stay wild.